This is my first painted D&D miniature. It is pretty garbage. I'm Dustin Sass from BG Tabletop. We're going to talk about how to get into playing Dungeons and Dragons. So let's go. All right, so in this video, I'm going to share my experience on how I got started, talk about some interactions I've had with guests in our store and how they got started playing D&D, and then we're also going to share some other examples and other ways you may be able to get going with your D&D adventure. All right, so if you're watching this, you may or may not be the dungeon master. So that's the person that's kind of in charge of getting the group together, in charge of creating the setting for your campaign, making sure the characters are ready to go. That was me when I got started. And I want to share my experience as the dungeon master. If you're not planning to be the dungeon master, that's fine. This will still help you understand where the dungeon master is coming from and how you can get started with your group as a player. So when I got started, I wanted to get a kit, something that just like has the basics for me to play with my friends. And when I started, I knew I wanted to play and to learn with new players because I wanted some grace as a dungeon master since it was going to be my first time being a DM and I knew I didn't know the game. And that was fine. So what we did is I went and I did some research. I looked up the essentials kit and the starter set. So those are two separate products. The starter set and the essentials kit are different in a couple different ways. So first way is the starter set comes with pre-made characters. And I always suggest this to our guests in our store. If you have a group of players who are not very familiar with fantasy tropes like dwarfs, elves, all that, like wizards, different classes, different races, I suggest that to those players because it kind of creates that environment and that setting, that world for them. And it takes less of a leap for them to imagine what the world is like. If you have a group that is ready to create characters, they're very familiar with fantasy tropes, I suggest the Essentials Kit because it does not come with created characters. And the great thing with the Essentials Kit is you can find the created beginner characters from the starter set online. So maybe you have one player that wants a character already made. Well, Essentials Kit, have them create that character. One thing to keep in mind if you do go with the Essentials Kit and you are going with the character creation, make sure your players are aware that there's going to be a bit of patience needed getting started with the game because you're going to create characters. And for first time players, creating a character can take up to an hour, I would say. If you're with a group, like your first character creation session could take up to 2 hours because you're all learning together. You're all figuring out how to create those characters together. There are some awesome online tools, and I'll kind of link those below, like D&D Beyond, a couple other character generation tools as well. Now, other difference between these two products, the main differences is they're the campaign. So the setting for your adventure are different. So the starter set is in the town of Phandalin, or sorry, the Phandelver Mines. Sorry, very similar names because the Essentials Kit is the town of Phandalin. Town of Phandalin, more sandboxy experience where you can go around and complete different quests. The Phandelver Mines kind of creates this crux for your adventure to start at. And then recently, Wizards of the Coast introduced a new starter set, and this is Stormwreck Isle, which takes place on an island off the Sword Coast. So the Sword Coast is where all three of these take place. It's kind of a region of the D&D universe. So I wanted the Essentials Kit, and when I got started, we played the town of Phandelver. And it worked really well playing with new players, and we definitely did not play correctly. And that is very important to keep in mind as you first get started. That's why I showed you my miniature. When you first start, you're not going to play the game correctly. You're going to learn some things as you go. As a DM, one thing I always did is I just made up rules on the spot. And if we really wanted to know how that rule and how that mechanic worked, I would let my group know, well, I'm going to do it this way. I think this seems fair. And this is what's going to happen to keep the story and keep the game going forward. And then we would look it up after the game. So when we started together. The first day was just character creation. And then I kind of went over like expectations and things to keep in mind as you play D&D and kind of asked them like what they imagine D&D to be like. None of them had played, so I was kind of curious to see where they were coming from. So that was my experience for getting started with D&D. Now I want to share with you some interactions I've had with guests in our store. So I know some players who actually for the first time ever played in person in our store, which is kind of a unique experience and very specific to the time we're living in with the pandemic, some players maybe learned about the game and started playing online, either with friends or signed up for an online session somewhere. And then for the first time ever, they came to our store to play in person. So that was a really cool experience to learn about. And I think it might be a good way to start for some players. Maybe you want to go jump into an online session. And what's kind of cool and what I learned from my first time ever playing a tabletop RPG is playing a tabletop RPG can feel a bit overwhelming, especially if you're coming from a background of board games. So I played a lot of board games. I'm used to the structure. I'm used to a game telling me what I can and can't do within that system. With tabletop RPGs, that doesn't really exist. You can pretty much do anything you want in a tabletop RPG. So my first few sessions, I kind of just sat at the table and I didn't really play the game. I kind of like listened and watched instead of really interacting with the world. I had a really good DM or GM at the time that brought me into it, but I was pretty poor player with giving him some give and take with that because I didn't know what to do. I was still kind of learning. Eventually, I warmed up and I figured out how to kind of play and interact with a world in a tabletop RPG, which was super cool. And I'm super glad I did because I now really enjoy playing and hosting tabletop RPGs. But going back to doing the same, I feel like there's less pressure maybe to speak up while you're online in a video platform. I know because I've hosted some as a GM, and when you have a video session of a tabletop RPG, there's only an opportunity for really one person to talk at a time. You can't have people talk over each other like you could maybe in an in person. You could have like some side conversations that are a little bit more subtle than the actual main conversation of the game. So that's one way that some players got started. Other times, players, which is something we offer, and you could check with your other game stores how they introduce new players to Dungeons and Dragons. We offer a create your first D&D character sessions, and these are fantastic because again, going back to the character creation process, it takes some time. So having someone lead you through that process is an excellent way to go through and really get your questions answered on how it works and how to design your character. And you have an opportunity to kind of like flesh out that character with more experienced person leading that session. In our store, we have someone that leads that, and it's super, super awesome. Afterwards, we have an opportunity to do a little combat. Usually, it just depends on how long the character creation process goes. So that's a good opportunity to introduce yourself to how combat and how those mechanics kind of work in D&D. So that is something you can check with your local game stores. They might just have beginner-friendly games to get started on, and it's less formal character creation process during that session. And then you get going with the game. Games can take like a session usually take like at least 2 to 3 hours. Some can go like for a full day. I know people have done D&D for like 10, 12 hours. So keep that in mind when you're going to a game store. It might be a couple hours at least to play. Other guests or customers that have come to our store and learned to play the game, some things they've done, they kind of did the same thing I did, grabbed an essential kit, grabbed it, and sat down and learned together. This can go really well, or it could go very poorly. Talking to some customers, some guests, they have come into our store and express some frustrations with trying to figure it out. And that's when we usually mention, like, hey, come to our store, come join a couple sessions. You'll get a feel for how the game works. And then you can go take that out to your friend group and or family group and start playing together. So those are kind of the three main ways I've talked to guests and customers in our store and how they've learned to play D&D. Now I want to share some other examples of maybe some ways you could get started. So some other ways you could get started are by kind of consuming content. I guess this is kind of one way, but I'm going to group two different ways of content into one way to get started. You can watch a lot of video casts. There's a lot of podcasts out there. Critical Role is a big one, and a lot of people maybe learned about D&D through Critical Role, through the podcast, and kind of just watching how that works and how people play the game, how the mechanics work. Keep in mind, D&D game not like that. It's very like those are professionals playing Dungeons and Dragons. They're voice actors, so that is going to be a very different experience than getting around a table with some friends. Not saying like it can't be like that, and not saying that either way is better than the other, but just keep that in mind if you're watching D&D or if you're watching Critical Role and you're going to a D&D session. Another content you can consume is you can kind of just read the books, read the adventure modules. Keep in mind if this is if you're a dungeon master. So with that in mind, one way that I learned about a different tabletop RPG is called Mothership. I watched a lot of actual plays of the game on YouTube or on different podcasts, or listen to them on different podcasts, and that helped me learn how that game works, and it helped me get ideas as a GM how to kind of create different game opportunities or mechanics in our sessions of Mothership. If you're not familiar with Mothership, definitely check out Tabletop RPG after you learned a little bit more about D&D. All right, and another way you can consume some content, and keep this in mind, this is, I would say, like 2 different ways, whether you're planning to be a player or a DM. You can read the books. So the handbook is a good thing to just kind of browse through and kind of read through it a little bit. Again, it can be a little bit overwhelming, so don't worry about like understanding every single thing you read through when you read it. Just kind of browse through it and let it wash over you as you read through it. And then as a DM, you can always check out like the monster books. This is more, I feel like, more just like cool to look at all the different monsters in D&D, and then also the campaign modules, so the adventure books. But again, keep in mind, this is if you're a DM, and you probably want to start with looking at the starter set or the essentials kit, looking at those modules first. How you can get started with D&D. If you have any questions, leave a comment below, or always come check out our tabletop game store in Los Angeles, BG's Tabletop, and we'll see you in the next video.
Yeah.